So welcome everybody to this research seminar at the Institute for Future Studies. I think it's historical because I think it's the first time we have more people in the room physically than we are online. And here's one more person coming. You need a share.
I do.
But there is a share.
Excellent.
So you can share this. That's very good. That's very good. Pontus Strimling, our head of the research team on artificial intelligence. So it's very fitting that you're here. But of course, the main person is Eva Erman. She's going to give a talk about artificial intelligence and the political legitimacy of global governance. I think I now realize that it's actually together with Marcus Furendal, which I haven't realized before. So I will mainly focus on something Eva. I'm sorry, but you can tell me. I can tell a little bit about it. Eva is a professor at the Department of Political Science and now the head of the department.
Semi-head.
Okay.
Tillförordnad.
Okay, wow. At Stockholm University and a Procedural Fellow at SCAS, I think, but Eva claims that you're once a Procedural Fellow, you're forever a Procedural Fellow.
That's Björn's line.
And also the founding editor and chief editor of Ethics and Global Politics, a journal from Routledge. And you received your PhD in political science at the Department of Political Science of Stockholm University in 2003. With the title of your thesis was Action and Institutions, Contribution to a Discourse Theory of Human Rights, supervised by Bo Linnensjö. And you in general work on political theory. Of course, you worked a lot on democratic theory, where our research instruments overlap on the boundary problem, but a lot about global context, and also about meta-theoretical questions like ideal theory and non-ideal theory, where you've written a lot about. But today, you are welcome to speak about artificial intelligence. But let me say something, Marcus Furendal. You received your PhD like 1 year ago.
Almost exactly.
Yeah. So what was the title of your PhD? I should know that because I was examining it.
Do your bit, claim your share.
Yeah, do your bit, claim your share. Yeah, I didn't like that. So I like it. Anyway. And now you have this project together on artificial intelligence and political theory in general. But anyway, Eva, go for it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, it's a new project, so everything is new. And the paper is extremely rough. It was literally written until yesterday or something. So it's very new, and this field is fairly new for both of us. So it's going to be very interesting, I think, 3 years now with this project. So thank you so much for inviting me. What I'll present now is a very rough draft of this Marcus and I have written, a preliminary title, Artificial Intelligence and the Political Legitimacy of Global Governance. And I find it extremely difficult to say AI in English as a Swede. I don't know, it's just, so if it's easy to say AI. Yeah. So it's really hard to present something about AI, but I'll try. AI, yeah. It's like Wi-Fi and Wi-Fi, it's the same problem. So, the study of the social and ethical impact of AI is still in its infancy. So there are many concepts that are very under-theorized, and I think AI governance is one of them. In the literature, AI governance is typically refers to the mechanisms and structures needed to avoid bad outcomes and achieve good outcomes, with regard to the problems and issues already identified and formulated in AI ethics. So in this paper, we argue that although this kind of outcome-focused view captures one important aspect of good governance, good AI governance, it emphasizes the emphasis on effects of governance mechanisms around the risk of overlooking important procedural aspects of good AI governance. So that's kind of the background to why we got interested in this. So, one of the most important properties of good governance is political legitimacy. Starting out from the assumption that AI governance should be seen as global in scope, largely global in scope, we have a twofold aim. The first is to develop a theoretical framework for theorizing the political legitimacy of global governance. And the second is to demonstrate how it can be used as a critical yardstick for assessing the legitimacy or lack thereof of actual instances of AI governance. With regard to the first main aim, a basic assumption that we make is that whatever else we believe that global political legitimacy requires, it must at least be minimally democratic. Of course, in political philosophy more broadly, this is not accepted by everyone. There's a lot of historical state of nature takes on this, Lockean accounts, which focuses on grounding it in tacit consent. There are also more like pre-political moral accounts, like utilitarian accounts, which would perhaps also reject this. It depends. And in political theory, more narrowly, there's kind of a popular stance right now developed by political realists who reject that totally, that democracy has anything to do with legitimacy, drawing on Bernard Williams' ideas that the legitimacy is only about securing order and stability. So there's several people that won't get into, but we don't defend this claim here, we just presume this, that at least it requires a minimally democratic. But rather than defending a substantive first-order theory of the global political legitimacy, our ambition is to spell out some normative and defend some normative conditions that we argue that any satisfactory account of the political legitimacy of AI governance should respect. So, how we do this. So this is done by elaborating the distinction between governance by AI and governance of AI in relation to different kinds of authority and different kinds of decision-making, either employing AI decision-making or applying decision-making on AI development and employment. So drawing on insights on political theorizing about global governance more generally, we argue that AI governance must take procedural aspect into account. And insofar as we accept that political legitimacy at least must be minimally democratic, we argue that an account of legitimacy of global governance must respect that governance of AI and governance by AI have a specific normative relationship and also raise different normative demands. So the presentation follows the structure of the paper, very simple. First section, we give a brief overview of the concept of governance in this kind of AI ethics literature. The second section focuses on the first part of our aim, which is about developing these basic normative considerations, constituting the theoretical framework. Thirdly, we apply the framework and try to find examples of in current global AI governance. And the final one winds up and try to respond to some of the worries raised by the outcome-focused view that we discussed in the first section. Okay. So in current research, at least I would say in research touching on normative issues in one way or the other, AI governance is typically understood as a subdomain of the broader field of AI ethics. AI governance often refers to the mechanisms and structures needed to achieve good outcomes and avoid bad outcomes with regard to a list of questions and issues that AI actualizes and which could be collectively decided upon. For instance, we give examples of two recent special issues on this topic, which maintain that understanding and managing risks posed by AI is crucial to realize the benefits of the technology. So it's very effects focused. So apart from that, we see that it's very outcome focused. We also presume in the paper that governance mechanisms will have to be global in scope. Largely, there are probably examples of that, but I think that's a worthwhile approach, because while much of the AI development is done by a few companies, primarily from the US and China, they are largely transnational firms, employing people across the world and affecting people across the world and implementing technology in a global market. So that's one of the reasons. And further, since issues and potential problems identified in AI ethics arise regardless of nation-state boundaries, their solution would probably then require global governance mechanisms, so that we focus on AI governance as a global phenomenon. So generally, what we see as a largely outcome-focused view is that, because in the sense that it's defined as whatever helps us solve the issues that arise in AI ethics. And that's how we see that governance is used and governance is discussed in this literature. So ethics guidelines, a lot of codes of conduct for programmers, international treaties on AI are all forms of governance on this view. There are potential ways of achieving good and avoiding bad outcomes on issues that relates to AI. So this focus on effects that we identify in the way we identify what is at stake, that they direct our attention towards certain issues and away from others. And we think that this outcome focus raises three worries, or three sets of worries, about AI governance research that we want to address. So first, it means that research and policy proposals around AI governance becomes intimately tied to prior assumptions about AI ethics. So the specific issues that receive most attention there becomes most discussed also in the governance literature. That's the first worry with the outcome view. Second, if AI governance research draw too much on the list of issues already identified in AI ethics, it risks overlooking institutions that do not pursue those aims more narrowly construed, as well as the vast literature on governance in political science and other fields, which investigates global governance more broadly, where AI is only part of global governance. The risk on having this identified list of issues focus on particular AI institutions instead of the overall governance structure. So, as we'll discuss later on, many AI applications are already covered by existing legislation. They're not made for AI, but applicable to AI. A third worry is that the outcome-focused understanding of AI governance naturally directs our attention towards the effect of governance mechanisms, whether they produce the consequences that are desired, rather than the goals pursued or the means by which to achieve them. And then I mean more broadly overall societal goals, rather than fixing certain things that are problematic. So we worry that there's a temptation to assess both hypothetical and actual governance mechanisms only in relation to how well they solve previously identified issues, and to overlook those goals, which those overall goals are, and how they are selected and pursued. So we see a risk that the question of AI governance is reduced to one of focusing on implementation and enforcement, which are only two functions in governance, and of an agenda that is already set. And I guess this also brings back the interest in political legitimacy, which is about how this should be done rather than what falls out from the process. So, moving now to section 2, to our more theoretical contribution. This prevailing outcome-oriented view stresses, we think, an important aspect of good governance. Given the potential of AI systems to contribute to economic productivity, but also threaten human autonomy, it makes sense to be closely concerned with outcomes. That said, measuring governance by effects of governance mechanisms run the risk of overlooking in procedural aspects of AI governance. One of the most important properties of good governance, at least from the perspective of normative theory, is political legitimacy. So in this second session, we develop a theoretical framework for analyzing political legitimacy of actual and hypothetical governance, AI governance institutions. So as I mentioned earlier, a basic assumption is whatever else we believe that global political legitimacy requires, it must at least be minimally democratic.
You're saying that since we have an interdisciplinary group, maybe you should say some more what you mean with legitimacy?
Yeah, we're coming to that. Yeah.
Very good.
We'll see if that is enough, what I say, but we'll come to that. So, as I said, also, we don't defend a substantive first-order theory, but try to spell out some normative conditions that we think that any satisfactory account, buying into this democratic minimum, should respect. And again, this is done by elaborating the distinction between governance of AI and governance by AI in relation to different kinds of authority and different kinds of decision-making. So the basic claim is that insofar as we accept that political legitimacy must be minimally democratic, an account of the legitimacy of global governance must respect that governance of AI and governance by AI have a certain normative relationship and raise different normative demands. So that's the basic claim. Now to Gustav's question a little bit. It's a tricky, many theorists that I've met that have done a lot of work on justice, like Alan Buchanan, have always said that don't ever go into the political legitimacy, because then you drown in it's a very fuzzy notion, I think. But anyway, global political legitimacy, conceptual and normative assumptions made in the paper. So, as I said, a large part of AI governance is global in scope. So this suggests that we should apply a conceptual apparatus that is fitting for the global context to address the question of political legitimacy. So today, I think it's widely acknowledged that it's a political legitimacy desirable quality of global governance institutions more generally, and not only those regulating AI. A shared goal of many national governments, civil society organizations, international organizations, and citizens is to strengthen the legitimacy in the exercise of political power in the global domain. And since global AI governance is part of global governance more generally, we analyze some general conceptual normative assumptions of how legitimacy and democracy should be understood in a global as opposed to a domestic context. And now to go back to the more core question, in the philosophical literature, political legitimacy is typically described as a virtue of political arrangements and the rules that are made within them. It often refers to the justification of coercive power or the justification of political power or political authority, and usually signify the right to rule in the classical sense, and on most accounts entail political obligations. This is just a general rough outline of how it is used. Moreover, it is commonly assumed that the principle of political legitimacy are supposed to regulate a particular kind of relationship, namely between, simply put, rule makers and rule takers, between political entities, that could be agents or institutions, that make, apply and enforce rules, and the subjects to whom these rules apply. So in brief, a principle of political legitimacy typically is identified by its function to regulate rule makers and their ruling, but specifying the conditions under which this ruling is just or justified, under which these political entities are entitled to exercise power and are worthy of compliance or and or support. That's a broad outline on the philosophical concept of political legitimacy. So this concept has mainly been developed for a domestic context, whereas nation state has been a tacit premise, and therefore is not fully fitting for the global domain. For the specific circumstances of global politics, such as the emergence of new forms of rule, new actors, and exercise of unchecked powers, and new forms of domination. So we think that to make the concept of political legitimacy useful for the normative purposes in the global domain, we suggest two modifications. The first amendment is suggested by Alan Buchanan is to abandon the strong idea of right to rule, presupposed by a traditional understanding, presuming an exclusive right to use coercive force, which is ill-fitting for the global politics, since no agent or institutions in global governance rule or even claim to rule robustly in that way. A distinguishing property of global political legitimacy seems to be a weaker coercive element, where being morally justified in exercising political power implies issuing rules and describing benefits and costs for compliance and non-compliance. So this is what we adopt here too. A second modification concerns the commonsensical understanding of rule and rightful authority and the right to rule, which typically is defined in law terms, legal terms, focusing on law and lawmaking. And also is often associated with the capacity to impose legal duties. That's the classical. But rulemaking in a global context ought to include not only lawmaking, but policymaking, all other kinds of decision-making on political matters. As I will discuss later on, this captures also the way certain entities in current AI governance actually influence AI development. So moving from the conceptual to the normative assumptions, we assume then that global AI governance arrangements must be minimally democratic in order to be legitimate. We believe that this relatively shared view, which harmonizes with a wide range of theories of legitimacy, since it is only expressed here as one condition of legitimacy, not necessarily a sufficient one. So it could be compatible with accounts requiring further conditions like distributive justice or even efficiency or effectiveness and so on. Moreover, since we do not pursue a substantive argument offering a specific theory, but rather aim to defend certain normative conditions that should be met when theorizing such a theory, we think it's important to adopt a broad notion of democracy as well, to make it compatible with the main, all basic democratic models, from voting-centered to deliberative, civic. So it's more minimalist to cover. You can add a lot of other conditions, so to speak. So democracy is seen as a normative ideal here, rather than simply a decision method, which means that the principles offered as a minimally democratic threshold are seen to political legitimacy, is seen as part of such an ideal. I think we'd have a very different paper if we look at democracy as a decision method, which is quite often done in this literature too. So the ideal alludes to the rule by the people, which is seen as a particular form of political self-determination or self-rule. A political entity, that could be a polity, institution, system, is democratic if and only if those to whom its decisions apply have an opportunity to participate in their making as equals. Also very broad, vague. This as equals can be interpreted in many different ways depending on which democratic theory is favored. So, in the literature on AI governance, studies are typically conducted focusing either at governance by AI or governance of AI, even if the terms are rarely used. So governance by AI is a suitable term, we suggest, to describe the phenomenon of existing governance structures adopting AI technologies as part of the governance mechanisms, such as when public authorities adopt automated decision-making, for instance. An important issue raised here is how the characteristics of AI technology affects existing governance structures or enable new ones. Many worry, for example, that the opacity of machine learning algorithms undermine the distinctively public character of politics and decision-making, which is often required for democratic legitimacy. Others think that the AI-based facial recognition, for example, could allow states to set up massive surveillance systems without the authority of the public. So there's a lot of questions raised here, and I think this is where most things are done, AI ethics related. Governance of AI refers, we suggest, to the actual and possible governing of the policy area of AI development and employment. The issue here is not how AI technology affects existing governance, but rather what types of governance mechanisms, what actually policies would steer the development and deployment of the AI technology in a desirable direction, and the characteristics of these processes. So this distinction, we think, as we have, the way we've surveyed the literature, is rarely mentioned at all, and above all, it's never problematized from any viewpoint of AI ethics. And we think this is unfortunate, since it risks hiding the fact that the debate surrounding AI governance incorporate two sets of largely distinct and different phenomena whose relationship ought to be theorized. The normative considerations regarding global political legitimacy I've just presented suggest that governance by and governance of AI are in fact related. Assessing the political legitimacy of existing and conceivable AI governance will hence require particular attention to what is governed and how it is governed and by whom. For this purpose, we argue that this distinction has normative implications for global political legitimacy. Okay. Current global AI governance consists of numerous standards. It's a messy world of ethics codes, policy frameworks, laws, guidelines, international policies. Given that we assume that political legitimacy requires a democratic minimum, the democratic quality of the whole regulative global structure will depend on, first, what kind of authority lends its support and on what grounds, and what kind of decision-making that are conducted. So fleshing out this argument is meant to support the wider claim that an account of the legitimacy of global AI governance must respect that governance of and governance by have a specific normative relationship and raises different normative demands. So we elaborate two kinds of authority involved in AI governance, which have fundamentally different normative status from a democratic standpoint, at least. What we here call authorized entities and mandated entities. So recall, according to the general understanding of democracy assumed here, the political entities making up the regulatory AI structure are democratic only if those to whom their decisions apply have an opportunity to participate as equals. That's the basic conceptual idea of democracy. So what we mean by authorized entities are precisely those entities which are approved directly through such a democratic procedure and thus have a right to make political decisions, or the stronger term, right to rule, in a broader sense that I described, law and policy making, but right to rule overall. Example of authorized entities are parliaments, of course, like the nation-state parliaments, but also the EU Parliament. The use of the term authorized is meant to capture in more abstract terms the normative status of those entities without necessarily tying them to a statist framework, since it opens up more space for future institutional arrangements in global governance with other properties and forms. Since the normative conditions spelled out here are meant to capture in more general terms what a theory of global political legitimacy should respect, it stays neutral with regard to which kinds of agents have the opportunity to participate as equals. A democratic authorization could take numerous different forms, depending on which democratic model we favor. Relevant agents are, of course, mostly democratic citizens, which are typical in the domestic context, but it could also be democratic states in a global arrangement, for instance. Moreover, the conditions also stay neutral vis-à-vis different formal decision rules, because even if we're used to individual majoritarian rule in a domestic context, a variety of voting rules are applied in global governance arrangements. So apart from authorized entities, we elaborate on mandated entities, which are, according to our view then, entities that have been delegated political power by authorized entities. Typical examples being executive bodies and administrative institutions. So these are the two building blocks that we draw upon in our... So that was about authority. And then we wanted to relate it also, these two authorities are tied to different kinds of decision-making from a democratic standpoint. So to explain this, I will return now to the idea of democracy as an ideal of self-determination or self-rule. The normative core of this ideal is the idea that a person is only supposed to be complying with rules she has an opportunity to authorize. So democracy, seen as a system of political self-determination, has to do with authorship, according to which an agent may only be rightfully coerced by a decision insofar as she's taken part in its authorization. This means that there's a fundamental difference on this view between coercive decision-making and non-coercive decision-making. Often coercive in real life politics is lawmaking, and non-coercive is policy-making. This also becomes a mess in the global domain because these categories don't really hold, because there are non-coercive laws like global administrative law, for instance. But it's the coercive element that has the normative significance, not whether it's called law or not. Here we use coercion broadly to make our argument neutral vis-à-vis different theories of democracy. It refers not only to the most common physical aspect, which is often stressed in the literature on coercion, involving sanctions, force, and so on, disciplinary action, but also what I call an authoritative aspect, which has to do with being subjected to an authoritative command. In both cases, benefits and costs are usually tied to compliance and non-compliance. Generally, laws are more fundamental and formal than policies, constituting a system of rules that set out principles, procedures, and standards to prescribe, permit, mandate certain relationship between individuals and institutions. Policies usually consist of statements setting out certain procedural or substantive goals of what should be accomplished in the near or remote future. Importantly, though, from a democratic point of view, policies comply with laws and are formulated within a legal framework. Even if they aim to actually fundamentally change an existing law, identify a new law that is needed, they do so within this kind of authoritative framework. So in our view, these two different kinds of decision-making, which are rarely discussed in global governance literature overall, are very important to distinguish from a democratic standpoint and from the standpoint of political legitimacy. Because these two decision-making, coercive and non-coercive, are connected to the two kinds of authorities mentioned earlier. In our view, it is the authorized entities who are the rightful lawmakers, or more accurately makers of coercive decisions, in the AI space. They may then delegate authority to mandated entities, which become rightful policy makers, or non-coercive decision makers in the AI space through this delegation. So that's the basic building blocks in relation to authority, different kinds of authorities, and different kinds of decision-making. Taking into consideration these two kinds of authorities and decision-making, we argue that a satisfactory account of the political legitimacy of AI governance should respect that there's a specific relationship between governance of and governance by AI. And since mandated entities gain their legitimacy through delegation from authorized entity, we argue that there is a justificatory hierarchy between authorized and mandated entities, where authorized entities have supremacy, normative supremacy, over mandated entities. This, in turn, we argue, creates a specific normative relationship. And the same justificatory hierarchy exists between governance of AI and governance by AI, where we argue that the latter then is normatively parasitical on the former. So it's the same kind of justificatory hierarchy there. So let me explain. Authorized entities in the AI space would be those entities which have the right to rule because they've been established through a democratic procedure, in which those affected, could be in one form or the other, I don't go into this here, have had an opportunity to participate as equal in shaping the control of the agenda, so to speak, concerning AI, generally seen as a fundamental property of democracy, setting out the societal goals, the basic form of our institutions, and so on. This is why authorized entities necessarily must engage in governance of AI rather than governance by AI, since they set up the legal structure for the overall aims, societal goals of AI development and employment, as well as the basic form of the main institutions in AI space. These aims and goals, we argue, cannot be deliberated and decided upon by AI. Not yet. Mandated entities, on the other hand, are delegated authority that make non-coercive decisions, applying to AI as a policy area or more generally, and may do so either by AI or over AI, so to speak. Typically, governance by AI are pursued in relation to a predetermined set of issues or a set of issues in a policy area with an already established legal framework, setting up the overall societal goals for AI development. And this is, I think, why in the predominant outcome-focused view, that AI governance by AI becomes interesting because it's already a set fixed view of what is the issues at stake, so to speak. So that, and in addition to this, according to the normative conditions we defend, for every delegation of authority follows a requirement of accountability. And of course, as with legitimacy, accountability may be understood in various ways in democratic theory and may be more or less demanding. We argue, however, that there is a property of accountability that is at its core, what we call here a property of accountability constituted by what we call a right to revocation. By that we mean a right to withdraw authority, withdraw political power. In other words, every mandated entity owes accountability, according to some standard, to the authorized entity which lent its authority. If the mandated entity does not live up to the appropriate accountability standard, which again depends on democratic theory, its authority may be withdrawn. That is at the core of the accountability relationship. This is the case for every step in a delegation in a legitimacy chain, for not only authorized entities may delegate authority to mandated entities, but also mandated entities are allowed to delegate political power further, often to a very specialized entity, as long as the first step of the chain is from an authorized entity. So there's a chain of legitimacy, and for every step there's an accountability, demand for accountability with the right to revocation, that is to the right to withdraw authority. So far now I've talked in rather abstract and broad strokes terms, theorizing this first part of our twofold aim. And I think this broad strokes, rough abstract theorizing is missing in this literature. It's needed because large part of the debate on AI governance has failed to recognize the distinction between governance of and governance by AI, and the outcome-focused contributions to the literature rarely ask what conditions are needed in order for a governance structure to be legitimate. But it also means, of course, this general broad stroke theorizing, that the basic what it means to respect these conditions will depend heavily on what specific theory, first order theory of legitimacy of governance, AI governance, what the theory aims to achieve, and what principles they're meant to regulate. So this will leave an open question. For example, if the intention is to theorize a non-ideal theory, probably several feasibility constraints would be tied to the theory, which presumably would make the respecting the normative conditions in a less demanding way than if we have a more comprehensive and ideal approach. Then we would probably add other requirements such as those of distributed justice and so on. So what it means to respect these basic conditions that we set out, it's depending on the theory. So this is why it's more on a meta level. Okay, so with this framework on the table, we move then to the second part of our twofold aim and trying to apply the framework on current AI governance to illustrate how it may be used as a critical yardstick for assessing the political legitimacy of instances of AI governance. So since there are basic normative conditions, there's often, of course, much room for interpretation, how to assess current governance, because it depends on what theory you're actually pursuing. But I think as a critical yardstick, it nevertheless can be used to assess particular governance arrangements and at least indicate where there might be a legitimacy problem. So in light of what we argued so far, we can conceive of 5 possible kinds of politically legitimate AI governance in the global domain. First, regarding governance of AI, there could be authorized entities in AI space that decide on general laws that are also applicable to AI. And this is fairly rarely discussed, actually. Often the literature focus on specific AI regulations. But there's a lot of laws already out there that also regulate AI. For example, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. Although the EU designed the piece of legislation to protect EU citizens' data in general, and it also have bearing on the AI technologies that were not even created when that was established. Second, there could also be authorized entities that decide on specific laws applicable only to AI. I think the most interesting example here, we will see how that ends, but the EU's push to draft the so-called AI Act, which is designed specifically for emerging AI technologies. This regulation is currently going through the AI law making process and will feature different coercively imposed rules for different AI systems. Third category is politically legitimate global governance of AI could also take form of mandated entities that decide on general policies and policy frameworks that are also applicable to AI. Here we have, for example, the UN Security Council, which recently debated emerging technologies, including AI, and expressed hopes that such technologies will make the entity's peacekeeping missions more effective. Even if the Security Council is not as clear-cut examples from our theoretical framework, since the UN does not have the same democratic structure as EU, it still gives a sense of how the suggested framework can be applied to assess legitimacy deficits and legitimacy in current global governance structure and identify which kinds of authorities and which kinds of decision-making is currently conducted. The fourth category, it could take the form of mandated entities that decide on specific policies and policy frameworks applicable only to AI. Examples of the specific AI policies frameworks that have been presented by numerous international organizations, for instance. NATO presented an AI strategy this year, which could become an important standard-setting document, for instance, for the adoption of autonomous weapons. That's one example. And then final category, the mandated entities that engage in government by AI, what people mostly focus on in AI governance. These here examples are easily found in domestic level. Assessment of AI-driven software now form the basis of various law enforcement agencies, distribute resources between different geographic areas, and machine learning algorithms are also used. At the global level, it's less. It's not easy to find examples yet, but it's likely that research based on an enabled AI technology form a basis for similar decisions globally in the future. They would just go under this fifth category. So, when assessing the legitimacy of AI governance in practice, I want to stress 2 important things about the theoretical framework. First, the view suggests that authorized entities cannot be legitimately engaged in governance by AI. That is, we assume that an AI system cannot legitimately govern humans or be the ultimate normative source of politically legitimate coercive decisions, in the sense that more traditional authorized entities can. An AI system could, for example, not be elected to parliament, and parliaments cannot shift to algorithmic decision-making without negatively impacting political legitimacy. Could do it for other reasons. So, such proposal would be defensible maybe if we view democracy as merely as a decision method, together with an assumption about that AI systems generally make better decisions than human lawmakers. But as emphasized before, we view democracy as an ideal of self-determination, according to which those who are supposed to comply with the rules have the opportunity to authorize them by participate in their making as equals. So given this, outsourcing decisions to AI systems would necessarily entail a loss of self-determination, a loss of democratic control. Then, of course, we see democracy as a partial ideal, so it could all be trumped by a more comprehensive theory of justice, for instance, where it might be important to let go of democracy or the political legitimacy, but that's a different paper. Second important implication is that many of the entities that are engaged currently in global AI governance do not fit into either of these 5 categories. So one of the most prominent kind of actor involved in current global AI governance are neither mandated nor authorized. but non-state private actors. Many AI developing companies and interest groups have recently authored various soft law documents, including ethics guidelines, standards, codes of conduct, to set to guide the continued work in the AI space. So one could, this could perhaps be seen as instances of corporate social responsibility, some initiatives that aim to promote societal humanitarian goals by supporting ethically oriented business practices. So one could maybe object to our view and claim that such initiatives are indeed politically legitimate, despite the fact that people in general have not had a say about them, because they promote the good outcomes that many of those interested in AI governance care about. So in response, we recognize that such initiatives from non-mandated and non-authorized entities might be part of good governance more broadly. But we insist that if these initiatives constitute the kind of global governance of AI, there will be clearly a loss of legitimacy. These initiatives have major normative limitations, since without delegation, there is no accountability, with the right of revocation, the right to withdraw authority. So whatever else these initiatives achieves in terms of good outcomes, they nevertheless lack in political legitimacy, since non-mandated private actors can only self-withdraw. And no other person or agent can have this right to withdrawal of political power, which means that they're not part of a legitimacy chain of the kind that we have sketched. So whether they contribute to good governance in some other respect is also an empirical question that I think is interesting in itself. So winding up. So in the first section, we identified 3 sets of worries that we considered is the worries related to the outcome-focused view. The first worry is that AI governance research become too tied to prior assumption about AI ethics, and the second worry about overlooking global governance more broadly that are relevant for AI governance. This seems easily fixed by simply widening the field and welcoming alternative approaches and research strategies. It's the third worry that AI governance risks being reduced to the question of how to implement and enforce an already fixed agenda that I think we primarily addressed in this paper. We've tried to address this worry by offering normative considerations that enable, in our view, more profound and systematic understanding of global AI governance by problematizing the assumptions upon which the outcome-focused view relies. Values of political legitimacy and democracy, the outcome-focused view investigates best solutions to an already identified issues that AI actualizes. Values of political legitimacy and democracy, on the other hand, raise more fundamental questions about how the list was identified and agreed upon in the first place, who was involved in deciding upon them, and through what procedures. So, moreover, they raise fundamental questions about overall aims and societal goals of AI development and employment, which are typically already implicitly presupposed when deciding on the mechanisms and structures needed to solve certain AI problems. So we don't in any way have anything against that outcome-focused view, like we don't try to falsify it or anything. I think our view rather complements it by directing our focus elsewhere to the procedural aspects of global governance. At best, it offers a more comprehensive analysis of what good AI governance consists of. Obviously, all this has to be investigated in much more detail, but I think even also the more narrow outcome-focused view would benefit from being incorporated in a broader approach to AI governance, such as the one that we have sketched. Thank you.
So now we are moving into the question and answer period, and there are some people here and some people online. So I'll remind everybody that if you're online, you use the chat function.
Can you speak louder?
Yeah, of course. Normally this should go out here, but it doesn't. So we have a strange sound system today. Anyway, so for you online, we use the chat function. So if you wish to ask a question, you should write in the chat, and also write your area of study, so we can take questions from different fields. Same here if you don't think I know it. We also take follow-up questions, and that you do with a finger if you're here, but you write follow-up in the chat. Okay, and with that, I think we should turn over to the question. Let me just quickly ask a first question to maybe get it a bit more concrete. I was just thinking this was rather abstract. Would you compare what you're discussing to the kind of governance of some similar things, global governance, like the World Wide Web or trade or something like that? if you put that into the context of these ideas that you had now, would, for example, the WTO, do they fulfill your ambitions? And what about the governance of the World Wide Web? What's new here, so to say?
Yeah. So I think it would be first a worthwhile project to really compare other technical innovations that have been longer back in time, because we always have a tendency to think that everything will create so new questions and so on, which might be true in the AI case. But I think a lot of the questions are also questions that have been raised for a number of other policy areas. So I think both it can be raised unique questions that needs to be solved, but also that it's actually fruitful to draw parallels, because it's easy to think that everything needs to be a new concept of legitimacy, democracy, and everything, because this is just algorithms. So it can be too mysterious in that way. So that would be needed to be unpacked. WTO, well, in global governance, you can never find examples like the EU, which is more the clear-cut kind of governance beyond the state that we have. So it's always hard when you're trying to think more idealistic about future global democracy and stuff like that to find clear-cut examples. So that can't really be done because of their structure, but there are more or less, I guess. And I think this can be used to at least see whether in WTO there might be legitimacy problems. For instance, in WTO, when it comes to trade, which I've written about elsewhere, is that some NGOs have a lot of power there, and how they are selected. They're not mandated. So this theoretical framework could be used in that case too. That on what grounds are they selected? I mean, it's not the.
So it would be more.
Yeah. Yeah, but it depends though, because that's a more classic view of democracy, that you have a parliament. But since our normative considerations are general, they can fill up with. I mean, it depends on what we mean by respecting them. So I think it also could be if you have a much more non-ideal theory, tied, for instance, to feasibility constraints of the kind of what can be achieved now or within this generation. I think one has to have a much more less ambitious idea of what it means to respect these conditions. So I think this can't be answered here, but it depends on the ambition of the theory, I guess, on the substantive theory.
Then it's Krista. Do we have a microphone for Krista, or should I send my microphone? Oh, it works with those. Okay, so you can speak loudly, Krista.
I'll speak there.
Yeah.
Thank you. So this is a question about the setup, actually, because you start off with the very wide definition of AI governance, right? Namely, mechanism structures needed to achieve certain outcomes or avoid certain other outcomes. That's extremely general, right? That will include traffic lights, right? That use AI because want to achieve traffic security, certain aims in safe traffic and so on. So that doesn't seem to be so interesting. And I agree then that the interesting thing is the buy and off. But the buy one, I wasn't clear. We shouldn't let the laws be set by AI mechanisms. But
here it comes, the super intelligent.
But what about all these different ways to help deliberation actually quite far closer to the decision? I'm thinking about cases like in Australia, where they try to sort of use AI to understand the preferences of patients. And then they had lots of test questions for patients, and they sort of sent in that. And then they constructed profiles of overall preferences of the treatments, which they hadn't themselves actually probably not been faced, right? It was general questions about certain factors, freedom, pain, and so on.
Yeah.
And that was pretty close sort of to the decisions, actually, right? Is that by, or is it just with the help from AI?
No, that's a very good question. I mean, let me take the traffic light. I don't find that problematic at all, because it's just in global governance, of course, the most interesting stuff are global in scope, but traffic lights are solved domestically. So that will be part of a multi-layered. If we look at the global governance, of course, that will, even in the kind of nation state, will solve most of those questions by delegating power. So it could include that without a problem, I think, for the paper. But I think we discussed this with how far, we're not really clear about this yet, but I think just spontaneously what I would say, how far can lawmakers use algorithm? I think it has an epistemic argument about being as well informed as possible. But the bindingness that comes from authorization is a normative demand. That's nothing to do, that can never be grounded in epistemic values. I would say. So, because that's about being the authors kind of to the rules under which we should abide by. But so that would be compatible with using algorithm as one source of information for how people work, as we do with other technical innovations. So,
can I follow up?
Yeah, so that would be my kind of spontaneous, the epistemic. I think it's important with the epistemic. I mean, truth is very important for democracy. So I think if we can get closer to truth about something, that would be good. It's just that it can't take us to this when we legislate. Yeah.
Yes, I'm not thinking about. I mean, the procedure is important, is that right? So we might have someone who sort of reads people's mind, right? And human, in an extraordinary capacity, and can sort of see what they want, right? They don't express anything, right? This person just reads people's mind and then make a decision, right? And of course, you can have such a version of some kind of AI version of that too. Is that epistemic, you said? But I mean, that's not the correct procedure, right? Because they're supposed to be able to express their interests and preferences.
Yeah, but in lawmaking, you vote on a legislation. So whatever, depending on the model, of course, if you have deliberative democrats, the deliberation before is very important. But we're open in this, we are neutral on. I would personally favor a deliberative model where deliberation is very important before the voting on a law, for instance. So, but here we stay neutral on that. But I don't see the problem with this person, human, reading people's lawmaker.
This is a question about how far. I mean, it has to be grounded in a certain way, the decision.
Yeah.
And I would have thought, that means that perhaps this mind reader decision is not legitimate way of authorizing law, even though it reflects the people's desires or wants. Right?
But I don't know why you talk about people's desires and wants. Why would legislators? They might don't. I mean, whether they care about people's desires and wants.
Whatever input for democratic.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So.
There was just sort of.
Yeah.
So
can you just say what is the problem with that? If it's a person who just knows more about human psychology than ever.
No, I'm actually not objecting to anything. I'm just trying to clarify what is the target here and what are the limits. I mean, when you talk about sort of the correct procedure, what does that mean? I wasn't clear.
Yeah.
Does it rule out using AI in this way or that way? I wasn't clear about that.
Maybe I could add that, because you did speak about that if you use for lawmaking, if you used AI for that would be negative for legitimacy because it would undermine self-control and autonomy. But as Chris's question pointed out, it might not at all do that because you can use AI actually to increase the self-control and autonomy of the lawmakers.
Yeah, but not in the authorization.
So can you exactly say what the authorization is? If, let's say, I say we authorize this and we support this decision on this AI that we used.
Yeah, but the elected, they do individual decisions on that, right?
Yeah.
They can be informed by lots of...
Okay, so what do you mean by the AI making the law?
That you have an algorithm making the decisions.
Okay, so...
No, I mean, leaving it to them because they don't have it, they are not biased in the same way.
So that, I guess, was not completely clear.
Okay, that's very important.
What does mean that the AI is making a decision? So it's okay if the AI, you said, we should do this decision, and then Christer and I were elected. We say, yeah, do that. That's okay. But not if there was not...
Yeah, the bindingness that comes from authorization is the normatively important component. But I think AI and other... lawmakers could still use a lot of epistemic sources for getting better grounded. Deliberation is one. Patient survey with using that is another. I
think you're missing a lot of what people worry about using AI in lawmaking, that it should be transparent how decisions were made.
Yeah, but
and it won't be if I'm using this algorithm.
But
then we decide. It won't be.
Yeah, but you don't decide. I mean, legislation is not. I mean, you don't. Yeah, you decide for you. Yeah.
The parliament,
But I mean,
AI, it's not.
But we don't have transparency what lawmakers think now. Let's remove all AI. We never go into their brains and know how they came to that grounding in their views. So I don't see a difference.
No, I think there's a difference because we can look at the arguments that were based on the. So that's how you look at here's how it was.
Yeah, but of course they need to, especially for a deliberative democrat, even if you have that as an epistemic source of good, you have to argue and deliberate argument, so to speak, in deliberation still. But I think that it's very hard. Now it depends on the democratic theory we propose, because transparency has different weight in different democratic theories. So I don't want to, but I think it's still the case that we never know the basis for representatives' choices in lawmaking.
So what do you mean when it undermines the self?
Yeah, if we leave the decision lawmaking to algorithms,
what does that mean to do that? Just give me exactly how it works.
To not have humans voting on legislating, taking a yes and no to a legal proposal.
Okay, and it makes a big difference. Chris and I say yes and no in between. Even though we just slavishly follow the AI.
Yeah, but slavery, we don't know if you are brainwashed representative now, that you're just, maybe it's your wife that you have brainwashed you and just, you do everything that your wife said.
That's a big difference if it's a human being then. But anyway.
Yeah, that's the thing with democracy.
Okay.
That's the thing with democracy.
I just had the same question. I don't, the value of authorization seems to kind of diminish with the human lawmaker's understanding of why the AI reaches the decisions it does. Like, it doesn't understand anything. That it doesn't even have. Then the human doesn't even have the competence to say, like, yes or no. And then you ask them. Then you wonder, like, why is it valuable? That they have that. And also,
But the representatives. That's. I mean, we often, in a party system, we vote on parties and then they're represented. Usually not like brain dead to it. I mean, just
more importantly, their competence is important.
Exactly. So yeah, and then of course again, since these are basic normative considerations that we should respect, it will depend a lot on for a substantive theory. It would depend where we draw the line. Of course, will differ. But here I'm after a much more categorical difference between lawmakers being algorithms and lawmakers being humans.
Yeah. So when you first suggested this, that outsourcing lawmaking AI would have this negative impact, loss of self-determination, I was thinking more, not so much about the legislators themselves, but the people who elected them. You might think, like, we elected these people to make the decisions, not this other thing. But I was thinking, like, maybe the people, all they care about is, like, whether the laws are good, right? The quality.
Still.
The value. So I don't see the value loss.
Even if the whole citizenship, I mean, the whole demos, only care about whether the laws are good.
What I do see is
to be democratic, it still has some.
Not to, like, give too much up to the robot, because we've seen lots of movies.
Yeah. No, I think that these are interesting because it's very attractive with the epistemic point to go back to epistemic principles to ground democracy, because they're very attractive to. We always want good decisions, but it's just not possible to ground democracy in epistemic principles all the way.
Pontus, you had a follow-up.
It's probably a long question.
No, go for it.
Okay. So I'm wondering about how you extend it. So I can see the arguments for lawmakers, but governance is a lot about making decisions for individuals or companies or something, right? So sentencing in court is part of government. Would you extend the same logic then? That as long as there's a human at the end pumping the gavel, they can completely depend on what an AI says, and the individual who wants to know why he was sentenced such a way will be told, well, because the AI said that you should be sentenced that way, I just follow the AI.
Yeah.
Is that still legitimate?
No, I mean, if you go into a theory of political legitimacy and defend that, that would have to, I would suggest, off the top of my head, this is my intuition, that in every step you have a right to justification and right to explanation. So that I would add to a substantive theory. Maybe we should discuss this in this paper. We have discussing that. But it's also not.
Supreme Court of Wisconsin.
Yeah. But the right to revocation has that could be developed in that direction, because I think that there's an interesting right to justification and right to explanation that is not explored very much so far in this literature, that could be made a lot of from a democratic standpoint, I think. So I agree that that's very important. So we'll see whether there's room for this here, or whether we should keep it more general.
And will really point to it because it has been a case in the US where someone
suing the algorithm
because it had been sentenced by an algorithm, or rather a judge who followed the algorithm, and the Supreme Court of Wisconsin upheld that the judge was doing correct, and that the only justification the person was entitled to was the judge saying, "I followed the AI's recommendation."
That's exactly. And what was the case you? Was that from Sweden as well? Today you.
I just heard about some journalists, but they wanted to get the source code for the Trelleborg algorithm decision making. And didn't get it.
So that's interesting in relation to transparency. So a full-blown democratic theory, of course, has a lot of key concepts like transparency and a much thicker idea of accountability than this kind of skeleton view, which would mean that that's interesting in itself, that if we can't give out the codes. So this is the same in the justice literature that had been applied, that as long as there's problems of background injustice, whatever you put in there will pop out there. So that's, I think, is also very relevant for political philosophers to engage in. Overall, there's so much to do in AI ethics when it comes to political philosophy, I think. Because, sorry.
I had a follow-up on this one too, then we should move on to the next main question. Karim, go.
Thanks. So I'm writing an article on a very close topic with Ludwig. Maybe we should talk about this.
Beckman.
Yes.
But not the Demos one. With not the Demos one.
Yes, that's the Demos one.
The
Demos problem.
No. This is another paper. This is another
different paper, because that was weird paper. The Demos one.
It was just follow up on this discussion on human decision makers and the relation to an AI's decision support system. So in the UAV literature on ethics of war and killing with unmanned aerial vehicles, there's a discussion where you make a distinction on where humans are on the loop, so to speak, so they can abort the acts of a machine that can act autonomously, or if they're in the loop, where they can shoot. They can the machine makes the targeting, but the human fires. Or when a human is out of the loop, where a human can only inspect the events the next day or afterwards, and make corrections for next kill, for example. And of course, and then you can also have a system where humans have much more hands-on, where it's humans that fire the rockets, but perhaps you have an algorithm that provides the intelligence, background intelligence on who's the terrorist or whatever, and those distinctions are thought to be relevant to assess the legitimacy in this context. So
but that would be a very important question also in this discussion about the law. I mean, where you're in the loop, so to speak. It's also when you start with a field like this, where it's either technicians doing some ethics dropping, and moral philosophers doing the super intelligent kind of person with the demos that should be included and should be voting, so we can produce 1 million more Swedes, and then it's hard with majority voting. So there are all kinds of but there is a big kind of gap there in between, with where it's very little political theory concerning more robust ideas of justice, not only impartiality in the kind of I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there overall, that has to do with, but also, I mean, transparency, but also the whole network of things connected to accountability, like the right to explanation. And if they can't even give out the codes, it's really a failure of, if it's going to work and it's going to be transparent, there has to be a different education among public officials as well, I guess.
Very good. Isaac.
Yeah, thanks. This is really interesting. So I'm kind of wondering where sort of governance stops, as it were, and many decisions that companies make, we don't normally think should be subject to wider democratic control, except insofar as they might impose externalities on others or something like that. But then, of course, with the problem with AI and companies using AI is that it generates a degree of power that they previously wasn't possible in this sort of sphere. So I guess just sort of what sorts of decisions does the
That's a very good.
democratic need
Yeah.
for?
Good. So I think this is so tricky in the global governance overall, not just applicable to AI, is that there's so many new forms of domination that we're not, like, at least not in theory, used to in the domestic context. But I think one important thing is that when democratic theory took this civil society turn in the 90s, everybody thought that now when we don't have kind of a formal track of securing a democratic say, we could have all these kind of NGOs and civil society actors making up for that loss in having their say. And that's a little bit sometimes also with the AI, like there's a lot of non-state actors that could do a lot of work, also very good work. So the question is, it's easy to draw the conclusion that if they have power, they should be legitimate. But it could also be that if they have power, maybe they shouldn't have that power. So it's easy to draw the kind of, because not every decision should be, we should never, I mean, what I think just here is that the exercise of political power means here exercise of power in the public domain. So many of the things that the companies do wouldn't even a theory of political legitimacy be applicable to, I would say. But that doesn't mean that other normative theories would be useful, like justice, in that case. Because I think it's easy to think that everything that we do and decide upon in AI should be politically legitimate. That would be an absurd view of politics. So one has to narrow it down to the exercise of public power that influence a lot of people. But then, of course, what a lot of the technical innovations now affects a lot of people. It's the same with climate questions, I guess. It's hard to say when politics ends. But it's an extremely relevant question for these kinds of things. That it might be that these ethics codes that companies have might be good. It's just that we shouldn't trick ourselves into thinking that that solves the legitimacy issue, I think. Because in many of these, in another paper we've written, Marcus and I, we've gone through the ethics codes. There's like how many, 80 central codes, and they're very ambitious, and it sounds like they solve the democratic problem and legitimacy problem and everything. So I think there's only a problem if we think that that's what's needed for political legitimacy of AI governance. I think that would be the problem. Not that it's not, might be good that they have regulation ethics codes that they try to live up to, that resembles or that are attracted to values we associate with democracy. That's very different from something being democratic. So,
happy with that?
I am, yes.
Very good. So then, Tim, it's your hand now. Do you still have a hand?
I turned it into a finger.
Oh, okay, that's cheating. Karim, do you still have a hand?
Yeah.
Very good. Go for your hand.
Thanks. So a question about the opacity discussion. I can recommend a paper by Jenna Burrell. I can give you the reference later. She has an interesting argument that we build on in this paper that we're writing with Ludwig, that when it comes to machine learning algorithms, it's not just that there's opacity, but that there are multiple layers of opacity that reinforce each other. So you have both opacity with regards to the data, that the data might be unknown, you don't know which data is and then you might have an opacity with regards to the algorithm cannot be easily inspected. But then there's also a kind of theoretical opacity, that machine learning is to some extent a field where we don't really understand what the full extent of what's going on, for example. There's no general theory about how many rows or layers there should be in a deep learning reinforcement algorithm for it to be good at a specific set of tasks, and so on. And Jenna Burrell also talks about what you kind of mentioned a bit, this kind of proprietary opacity. For example, in the Compass case in Wisconsin, the reason they couldn't tell the defendant why he was arrested or why he couldn't be free was because the state has a contract with a company, and the company has the right to withhold the information about what variables are in the algorithm and how the algorithm looks like and who's working on it and and also what the company wants to achieve with its algorithm. So that you have that kind of proprietary opacity. And then in the paper, we also talk about sociological opacity, that, in a society where AI is still very poorly understood, that kind of adds an additional layer. Because, of course, if the lawyers can't understand what's going on, it's going to be even more difficult for the defendant to understand, because nobody can explain that in a plausible way. So,
That's very interesting. And I think this, in order to try to relate it to the theoretical framework, I think that in order for mandated official, like public authorities to delegate further to companies, there must be certain, according to our view here, then there must be certain demands on transparency. And if it's going to be the right of revocation, you need to know, as a delegated body, when you do that, you need to know why. And in order to know why you're not satisfied or they're not accountable, you need to have transparency. So that, I guess, then it will differ very much whether you delegate power to a company that has said that all this is secret. Maybe then that couldn't be allowed from a democratic standpoint if it's going to be used in public decisions. Maybe, I don't know. Yeah.
So then we have a question from an online audience. Katarina, Bernd, Rasmussen. Voila.
Thanks for a very, very interesting talk, Eva and Marcus. So I'm thinking a little bit. I think this bringing out this distinction of governance by and governance of AI is a very good starting point, and I think it's helpful to see that there's a lot of things crammed together in this AI governance term, as it were. But I'm wondering a bit if because you kind of bring this distinction to bear on these other two kinds of distinctions. Okay. These other two kinds of distinctions of first, two kinds of authorities in terms of authorized versus mandated entities, and then two kinds of decision making in terms of coercive, non-coercive. But I'm wondering whether or not the kind of main point of your discussion doesn't really kind of boil down to this issue of transparency that becomes important in this democratic context because of accountability and authorization and right to revocation, as you said. So I'm just wondering whether it's not that, that there are kind of areas or decision contexts where we are, in a sense, interested in the procedural virtues or the procedural values in the decision making. So there's something going on within the decision making process that we care about and that we value, irrespective of the outcomes, or at least also value. And then there are other areas, maybe in decision contexts, where we're mostly interested in good outcomes. We don't really care what goes on in there in the black box, but we care about that there are good outcomes coming out. And then, of course, kind of considerations on democracy, transparency, accountability, all these kinds of things have bearing on that we are kind of, in certain contexts, we are interested in the processes of decision making. So the distinctions that you use kind of have bearing on this. On these two different kinds of decision-making contexts, what we care about in these different contexts. But in the end, even a mandated entity or even a non-coercive decision-making process might be of the kind where we care about the procedural stuff that goes on. We care about the procedural values that might or might not be there in the decision-making process. And then we might have more or less reason to care about what goes on in the AI processes that possibly underlie such kind of decision making. Yeah. As much as we might be interested in, for instance, human, opaque stuff that goes on in the decision making. For instance, the lawmakers' implicit biases that they decide from, and that we don't really see, but that might actually lead to problematic decisions, both in procedural and in outcome terms. And that we might also care about manipulation, like when the spouse of a representative makes the decisions for them. So these kinds of opaque processes in the decision-making process might be AI related, of course, and they're specific things going on, because often there's kind of secret code, AI at play, but they might also be human, right? So there might be manipulation, there might be implicit biases and stuff. So we care about this kind of getting to look, having transparency, getting to see what's going on in these decision processes, because that is important in some contexts. And then AI is one such instance where we might then, for instance, call for open code AI systems. And then, of course, if that is granted and we can actually see what's going on, then this might actually be a very good way of actually governing by using AI in the governing process, because then it's transparent. We have all these procedural values, and also maybe even better decisions, because the AI is making smarter decisions than than humans. So, so then it would be kind of a question of transparency, maybe more than.
Yeah, I think this is thanks. I'm taking this on board now. I think I agree with what you're saying. So first, I mean, just to say, one mandated entities can also govern of AI. That will be the most common, but they also can do it by. So in reality, that most of the time it's of AI, even for mandated entities. That was just not. But with the by AI, I think this comes back to the idea of accountability. That it seems very hard to when we talk about accountability, we presuppose transparency, because even to know whether or not to withdraw power, we need to know why something went wrong. So I guess it's intimately related, and that might be something we should work on in this paper. But I think also, I came to think what you're saying, that sometimes we value the process and the clarity and the transparency. So in principle, it might be the case that a by AI could be even more transparent, since if we have an open code, it's probably more open than the decisions by non-AI. So in a way that just a thought that it could be, even if it's not, because companies have their secrets, it could in principle be even more transparent and open, because people might lie or hide things from what their initial or their justificatory. I mean, they might have a hidden agenda in a way that an open code would not. So, but I agree that. But I think that when mandated entities are using algorithms as decision making, it's usually because we want good outcomes. In those circumstances, I presume that the value of the process itself is not as important. I guess that's when we want to use them, but they should still be transparent, of course. Yeah, but that's a very good point.
Very good. I think on that note, join me in thanking Eva for this talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We have some kind of political science fall, so the next talk coming up is November 17. John Terrell, Commitments and Bargaining Delays in Parliamentary Democracy. We don't usually only stick to Stockholm, so we also have November 24th, Bo Rohrstein, A Social Science Dilemma. Is there a contradiction between democracy and quality of government? So you're all very welcome then. Thank you.